My parents said I was not welcome at Christmas. I didn't cry or argue. Instead, I changed every lock in the penthouse, the front door, the garage, even the private elevator. On Christmas Eve, they arrived with arms full of gifts, but found their keys useless guests waiting, and no way inside. By morning, the calls kept coming 33 missed calls. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to smile through the pain of family betrayal while secretly plotting your next move. I am telling you this now from the sofa in my own living room, a warm cup of tea resting beside me and the city lights quiet beyond the glass. I can smile when I say it now, but that Christmas did not begin with peace. It began with my mother deciding that the daughter who had paid for almost everything was the one person who did not belong at the table. It was exactly 3 days before Christmas in the heart of Buckhead, Atlanta. The penthouse was filled with the scent of roasted pine, expensive catering prep, and the suffocating weight of my family's expectations. I was standing in the sprawling marble kitchen, holding a glass of Cabernet, watching the glittering Atlanta skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I am Nia, 34 years old, the founder and CEO of my own private equity firm. I spend my days navigating cutthroat boardrooms, managing millions of dollars, and commanding respect from some of the most powerful people in the country. But none of that mattered inside these walls. Peace was never an option when my mother Vivian was in the room. My mother marched into the kitchen, her designer heels clicking sharply against the imported Italian tile. She was dressed impeccably, her hair styled to absolute perfection, wearing the kind of restrained, quiet luxury she believed signaled true wealth. Vivian had spent her entire life obsessed with respectability politics. She was a pastor's wife, deeply terrified of stepping out of line and desperate to prove that our family belonged among the city's black elite. She walked straight up to me, her eyes flashing with a familiar annoyance, and snatched the wine glass right out of my hand. She set it down on the granite island with a hard thud that echoed in the quiet room. "I need you to pack a bag and leave right now," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh, venomous whisper so the catering staff in the next room would not hear. "Preston's parents are flying down from Boston on Christmas Eve. You know his family comes from traditional old money. They are extremely conservative. They have a certain way of doing things and a certain standard they expect. Your constant loud talk about your business ventures, your aggressive independence, and the fact that you are 34 years old and still single, it makes them deeply uncomfortable. It makes our entire family look bad. I have booked you a room at a hotel downtown for the weekend. This Christmas dinner has no place for you." I stared at the woman who gave birth to me. The woman who sat in the front pew of my father's church every Sunday, preaching about grace, love and family unity, was now kicking her own daughter out of the house. She was actively pushing me away to appease her white son-in-law and his supposedly elite family. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch. I had learned long ago that showing any emotional reaction only gave her ammunition to call me angry, unstable, or bitter. I just looked at her, letting the heavy silence stretch between us, watching a nervous twitch develop in her jaw as she waited for my inevitable explosion. But before I could even formulate a response, a shadow fell over the kitchen entrance. Preston strolled into the room. My sister Chloe's husband was a 32-year-old white man from Boston, who walked with the unearned confidence of someone who believed the universe was built entirely for his convenience. He leaned casually against the doorframe wearing a pristine cashmere sweater and a smug, condescending smile that instantly made my blood boil. Preston had always viewed me as a threat, and he took every opportunity to deliver subtle microaggressions designed to put me in my place. "Do not be too sad," Nia, Preston drawled, delivering his words with that slicing, arrogant tone he always reserved just for me. "Not every woman is cut out for the model family dinner picture. Some women are just meant to be alone with their spreadsheets and their empty apartments. You should go enjoy the hotel room, treat yourself to room service. It will be much less stressful for everyone if you are not here trying so hard to prove how strong and independent you are while the rest of us actually celebrate family." He pushed off the doorframe, walked over to the kitchen island with slow, deliberate steps, and tossed a crisp white envelope onto the marble surface. It slid across the smooth stone and stopped right in front of me. By the way, Preston added, his smirk widening into a full grin, your mother mentioned you would be thrilled to cover the invoice for the five-star private chef, since you will not be joining us. It is $15,000. Consider it your Christmas gift to the family to make up for your unfortunate absence this year. I looked down at the invoice resting on the marble counter. $15,000 for a dinner I was explicitly forbidden to eat. I looked back up at Preston, taking in his smug, entitled face, relishing his false sense of superiority. Then I looked at my mother, who was watching me with expectant, demanding eyes, waiting for me to submit and open my wallet the way I always did when keeping the family peace was on the line. I let a slow, remarkably calm smile spread across my face. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored designer blazer, pulled out my sleek black corporate credit card, and handed it directly to Preston. He snatched it from my fingers, his smirk turning into a triumphant, victorious grin. He genuinely thought he had won. He thought he had successfully put the loud, single, successful black woman back in her proper place. He thought he was the smartest man in the room. "Merry Christmas to you both," I said softly, my voice perfectly steady and devoid of any anger. "Enjoy the dinner. It is going to be unforgettable." I turned on my heel and walked out of the kitchen. I did not look back. I went straight to the guest suite, where I kept a few personal items, packed a small leather overnight bag, and walked down the long corridor toward the front door. As I pulled my suitcase down the hallway, the sound of their voices echoed from the kitchen. I could hear them laughing. I could hear my mother praising Preston, telling him how wonderful and peaceful the holidays were going to be, without my unnecessary tension bringing everyone down. They were literally celebrating my departure, raising a toast to my absence. I stepped out of the penthouse and let the heavy custom oak door click shut behind me. The hallway was dead silent. I walked into the private elevator, swiped my access card, and pressed the button for the ground floor lobby. The doors slid closed, sealing me inside the mirrored box. As the elevator began its smooth descent, I pulled my phone from my pocket. My hands were not shaking. My heart rate was completely normal. I did not text my mother to complain about her cruelty. I did not call my sister Chloe to cry about how unfair it all was. Instead, I opened a highly secure messaging app and typed a quick, precise message to my chief accountant and my lead security contractor. "Begin auditing the entire financial system immediately," I typed, watching the message bubble appear on the screen. "And send the emergency security team to my location on the afternoon of the 24th. It is time to change the locks." They laughed after I left, convinced they had successfully hidden the family disappointment before Preston's parents arrived. They thought the $15,000 charge was the final proof that I would always pay, always retreat, and always protect their image. What they did not understand was that I had stopped arguing because I had started documenting. By the time the elevator reached the lobby, my audit request was already moving through accounts they had never imagined I could see, and Christmas Eve had quietly become a deadline none of them knew existed. I merged onto the connector, the quiet hum of my Aston Martin, cutting through the crisp Atlanta night. The city lights blurred into streaks of gold and red, reflecting off the windshield as I drove away from the penthouse. I was barely 5 miles down the highway when my phone buzzed through the car audio system. The screen on the dashboard flashed a name I expected but did not want to see. It was Chloe, my golden child of a little sister. I tapped the screen to answer, letting the silence stretch for a second. "Nia, please tell me you are not actually mad at Mom." Chloe's voice filled the car, dripping with that artificial syrupy sweetness she always used when she was about to deliver an insult. "You know how stressed she gets around the holidays. Besides, Preston just bought me a brand new Porsche Cayenne today. It is parked in the garage right now. He just wants everything to be absolutely flawless when his parents arrive. They are used to a certain standard, Nia. You have to understand that. Why do you always have to fight it? Why do you insist on playing the exhausted, strong, independent woman when it only makes you look bitter?" I gripped the steering wheel, keeping my breathing perfectly even. Hearing her talk about her husband's supposed wealth triggered a visceral memory from exactly 10 years ago. A memory of bleach-burnt coffee and bone-deep exhaustion. 10 years earlier, I had been a sophomore studying finance and economics when my parents sat me down and announced that the family savings could no longer support both daughters. Chloe had been accepted into the private academy Vivian considered essential to her social future, and my mother had already decided which child would be sacrificed. She talked about connections polish and putting Chloe in rooms where she could meet the kind of husband who would elevate the family. My education, she said, could wait because I was the capable one. So I left school in the middle of the year. The savings that had been set aside to help me finish college were redirected to Chloe's tuition uniforms activities and every expensive detail Vivian believed would make her fit into elite circles. I worked 3 jobs at once: bank teller during the day, waitress in the evening, and freelance bookkeeper late at night. I learned to build financial models while standing behind a counter on aching feet. Chloe learned which fork to use at formal dinners. My family called both of those things sacrifice, but only one of us was ever asked to make it. I still remembered the night Vivian made the decision official. I had come home carrying a folder from the university financial aid office, convinced that if I showed my parents exactly how small the remaining tuition gap was, they would help me stay enrolled. Chloe was sitting at the kitchen table with a glossy brochure from the private academy spread open in front of her. Vivian did not even look at my paperwork. She slid the brochure across the table and tapped a photograph of girls in blazers standing beneath stone arches. "This is where your sister needs to be," she told me. "These families understand legacy. They understand marriage networks and how real influence is built." I asked her what happened to the money Grandma had helped my parents save for my education. Vivian's expression hardened immediately. She said family money belonged wherever it produced the greatest social return. Chloe had potential because she was charming, beautiful, and willing to learn the rules of the right rooms. I was too blunt, too independent, too focused on work. In my mother's mind, investing in me meant producing a woman who would keep challenging her. Investing in Chloe meant producing the daughter she could display. Marcus did not defend me. My father folded his hands on the table the way he did before a sermon and told me that strong people were called to carry heavier burdens. He said I had always been resourceful. He said I would find a way. Then he signed the tuition authorization that moved the family savings toward Chloe's school. I found a way because I had no choice. For the next year, my life became a schedule written in exhaustion. I opened the bank before sunrise, changed uniforms in a restaurant bathroom, then came home after midnight to reconcile invoices for small businesses that could not afford full-time accountants. Every paycheck had a destination before I even touched it. Rent, books I bought secondhand, application fees for night classes I took whenever I could afford them. Meanwhile, Vivian mailed me photographs of Chloe at charity luncheons, equestrian events, and holiday galas, as if I were supposed to be grateful for the life my sacrifice was financing. Chloe never asked how I was doing. She called when she needed spending money. She called when a school trip required a new coat. She called when Vivian decided the other girls carried a particular handbag, and Chloe could not be seen with last season's model. Every request arrived wrapped in the same sentence: "You know this matters for the family." That sentence followed me into adulthood. It followed me when I finally rebuilt my education through night programs and professional certifications. It followed me when I started my first investment vehicle with a laptop, a borrowed conference room, and clients who cared more about returns than pedigree. It followed me when the fund grew large enough that the same people who had once called me difficult began introducing me as proof of the family's success. And now Chloe was on my car speakers bragging about a Porsche while telling me that independence made me bitter. I looked at the glowing dashboard and almost laughed. The private school plan had worked exactly the way Vivian wanted. Chloe had learned how to perform wealth, how to marry into an old money surname, and how to treat financial dependence as elegance. What none of them had taught her was how to recognize insolvency. "Enjoy the car," I told her again before ending the call. "Just make sure the person who bought it actually owns the money." The warning went completely over her head. She gave a little offended scoff, started to say something about Preston's family trust, and I disconnected. 10 years earlier, I had walked away from a university classroom because my family decided Chloe's image mattered more than my future. That night, for the first time, I understood how expensive their obsession had become. The cost was no longer just my lost years. Someone was bleeding real money to keep the fantasy alive. The cruelest part was that Chloe remembered those years differently. To her, private school had been a family blessing. The uniforms appeared, the tuition was paid, the social events happened. She never saw me calculating whether I could afford groceries after a 12-hour shift. Vivian made sure she never had to see the cost. That was why her phone call mattered. It was not just another insult. It was proof that the same family equation had survived for a decade. Chloe received the lifestyle, I received the bill, and everyone called the imbalance love. The difference now was that I finally had enough distance to audit the equation instead of obeying it. What Chloe called strength had never been a personality trait. It had been the survival skill my family forced me to develop. I became disciplined because no one caught me when I failed. I became financially literate because every dollar mattered. I became independent because dependence inside our family always came with a bill someone else expected me to pay. That history was why I did not argue with Chloe on the phone. I had already spent 10 years proving that I could survive what my family refused to carry. I was done presenting evidence of my worth to people who only noticed it when they needed money. And now, sitting in a Porsche bought with questionable money, she was calling me bitter. I am not mad, Chloe, I said, my voice as smooth and reflective as glass. Enjoy the new car. Make sure you read the financing paperwork carefully. I tapped the screen and ended the call before she could process the warning. I did not have the time or the patience to listen to a woman who had never worked a day in her life lecture me about my independence. The car cabin fell silent again, but only for a moment. A sharp, urgent chime broke the quiet. It was a customized alert tone reserved only for Tier 1 financial emergencies. A secure email from my chief accountant had just hit my encrypted inbox. I pulled over into the parking lot of a high-end shopping plaza in Buckhead, shifted the car into park, and opened the message on my phone. My chief accountant had been executing the deep dive audit I requested as I walked out of the penthouse. What I expected to find were some inflated credit card charges, or a few hidden expenses Vivian had tried to bury. What I saw on the screen made the air catch in my throat. It was a flagged transaction report from Grace Fellowship, my father's church. Over the past 24 months, massive sequential withdrawals had been quietly siphoned directly out of the church's community charity fund. We were not looking at a few missing hundreds. We were looking at a gaping deficit of nearly $2 million. I scrolled down to the routing information tracking where the stolen funds had been deposited. The money had been funneled through a sophisticated web of wire transfers bouncing through 3 different intermediary banks before finally landing in an account held by a limited liability company. I pulled the corporate registry data for the LLC. The company was registered in Massachusetts. The primary business address listed was a prestigious street in the historic Beacon Hill neighborhood of Boston. The exact same address Preston claimed was his wealthy family's generational estate. The puzzle pieces snapped together with terrifying clarity. Preston was not old money. His family was completely broke. He was maintaining the illusion of massive wealth, buying luxury cars for my sister, and funding their lavish lifestyle by secretly bleeding my father's church dry. And my parents, obsessed with the prestige of having an aristocratic son-in-law, were either completely oblivious or actively covering up a massive financial crime. I sat in the glow of the dashboard lights, the leather steering wheel suddenly cold under my grip. I opened my laptop right there in the driver's seat, bypassing my phone screen to run a full corporate background check on the Massachusetts Limited Liability Company. I bypassed the standard public records and logged directly into my firm's proprietary database. The truth unraveled across my screen in a series of brutal, undeniable financial filings. Preston's family was not old money anymore. They were ancient history. The grand Beacon Hill estate he constantly bragged about had been leveraged to the absolute limit. His parents had filed for bankruptcy protection 3 years ago, drowning in unpaid country club dues, defaulted business loans, and a mountain of quiet, desperate debt. Their accounts were frozen. Their credit was non-existent. Preston was a trust fund baby, without a trust. A man wearing a luxury suit tailored from a house of cards. He had come down to Atlanta looking for a mark, and he found the perfect target in my mother's obsession with social climbing and my father's desperate need for elite validation. Preston was using his status as the white, supposedly aristocratic son-in-law of a prominent black megachurch pastor to bypass basic financial oversight. He had somehow convinced my father to give him access to the Grace Fellowship Community Charity Fund under the guise of high-yield investments. Instead of investing it, Preston was bleeding the church dry. That brand-new Porsche Cayenne sitting in the penthouse garage was not a gift from a loving husband. It was bought and paid for by the tithes and offerings of working-class parishioners who trusted my father. I traced the withdrawals backward before I called anyone. The church fund had been created for housing assistance, emergency food grants, and small community programs that depended on predictable cash flow. The pattern in front of me was not a single bad investment. It was systematic extraction. Each transfer had been broken into amounts small enough to avoid immediate internal alarm thresholds, then routed through entities with bland names before landing in the Boston company connected to Preston. The dates matched the visible upgrades in Chloe's life with sickening precision: a luxury deposit, a jewelry purchase, the Porsche financing. The numbers were not gossip, they were a timeline. My chest tightened with a protective fury. My father, Pastor Marcus, was a man of flaws, deeply entrenched in image management and respectability politics, but he had spent 30 years building that congregation. I assumed that finding out his golden son-in-law was a common thief would shatter him. I assumed he would call the police before I even finished explaining. I grabbed my phone and dialed my father's private number. He picked up on the second ring. The background noise of the penthouse was completely silent now, the caterers likely dismissed. "Dad, listen to me very carefully," I said, keeping my voice urgent but controlled. "You need to log into the church's main community fund account right now. Preston is not who he says he is. His family is bankrupt. He has been systematically siphoning money from the charity fund into a shell company in Boston. There is a $2 million deficit. He stole from the congregation, Dad. He bought Chloe's car with stolen money." I waited for the gasp. I waited for the righteous, booming anger of a betrayed pastor. I waited for him to demand I send the files to his email. Instead, the line was dead quiet. The silence stretched thick and suffocating. "Nia," my father finally said. His voice was not shaking with rage. It was low, hard, and terrifyingly calm. "I do not know what kind of fabricated nonsense you are looking at on your computer, but you need to shut your mouth. You will not say another word about this over an open phone line. You will turn your car around, you will drive back to this building, and you will come straight upstairs. Do not make me tell you twice." The line went dead. The sharp click echoed in the quiet cabin of my car. A cold realization washed over me. He did not ask for proof. He did not sound surprised. He sounded like a man who had just been caught trying to sweep a disaster under the rug. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the shopping plaza. The drive back to the penthouse felt entirely different from my departure. 10 minutes ago, I was leaving to protect my peace. Now I was walking back into a war zone. I navigated the Buckhead traffic with mechanical precision, my mind processing the chilling reality of my father's reaction. If he knew about the missing money, why was Preston still standing in my kitchen drinking expensive wine? Why was Chloe parading around in a stolen car? I pulled into the private underground parking garage of the high-rise. I left the Aston Martin in my reserved spot and took the private elevator back up to the penthouse. The doors slid open with a soft chime opening directly into the grand foyer. The scent of the $15,000 dinner still hung in the air, a sickening mix of roasted herbs and expensive wine. I stepped into the expansive living room. The lights were turned down low, casting long, sharp shadows against the custom artwork on the walls. I expected chaos. I expected my father to be pacing the floor. I expected Preston to be packing his bags in a panic. I expected my mother to be in hysterics over the impending social ruin. But there was no panic. There was only a chilling, calculated stillness. They were all sitting in the formal living area. My mother Vivian sat perfectly upright on the Italian leather sofa, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her face a mask of stone. Chloe sat next to her, clutching a designer throw pillow, her eyes darting nervously toward the floor. My father stood behind one of the velvet accent chairs, his pastoral posture rigid and commanding. And lounging in the armchair directly across from them, swirling a fresh glass of bourbon, was Preston. I was not sweating. He was not begging for forgiveness. He was looking at me with the exact same arrogant smirk he wore when he handed me that catering invoice. No one was yelling. No one was demanding answers from the thief in the room. Instead, all four pairs of eyes were locked directly on me. They were cold, hostile, and brimming with a unified, unspoken threat. Sitting dead center on the massive glass coffee table between us was a thick stack of legal documents. A silver luxury pen rested perfectly parallel to the pages. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the faint clinking of the ice in Preston's glass. It was not a confrontation meant for the man who stole $2 million. It was an ambush, and I was the target. I walked toward the coffee table, my eyes locked on the thick stack of legal paperwork. Before I could even ask what they were, my father shattered the silence. His pastoral composure, the serene mask he wore every Sunday for thousands of congregants, completely vanished. He slammed his fist down on the back of the velvet chair. "Preston did not steal anything," my father roared, his voice bouncing off the high ceilings. "That is money I lent him to invest. Do you hear me? It was an authorized allocation of funds." I stared at the man who had raised me, absolutely sickened by his delusion. "An authorized allocation?" I asked, my voice deadly quiet. "Dad, he bought Chloe a Porsche today. He is paying off his bankrupt parents' country club dues in Boston with the charity money your congregation donated for the community housing project." Before my father could respond, my mother moved. Vivian closed the distance between us with terrifying speed. Her hand swung through the air, and the sharp cracking sound of her palm striking my cheek echoed through the penthouse. The force of the slap snapped my head to the side. My skin burned instantly, a hot, stinging physical manifestation of 34 years of conditional love. "Are you going to use this trash evidence to destroy this family's face in front of our white in-laws?" My mother hissed, her face inches from mine, her eyes wide with manic desperation. "You think you are so smart with your audits and your computers. You think you can just march in here and blow up your sister's marriage because you are jealous." I slowly turned my head back to look at her. "Jealous, Mom, they are broke. His family is a sham." "I do not care," she spat, her voice trembling with the toxic weight of respectability politics. She pointed a shaking finger at Preston. "His family brings this house respectability in Atlanta. Do you understand that? They give us access to rooms and social circles your new money could never buy. On Christmas Eve, Richard and Beatrice are walking through those doors, and they are going to see a flawless, wealthy, elite family. I will not let your bitter, lonely attitude ruin the image I have spent my entire life building." My father stepped around the chair and planted himself between me and the coffee table as if his body could turn theft into theology. He kept insisting that the transfer was temporary, that Preston would return everything after a Boston real estate deal closed, and that no one at the church needed to know because the money had never truly left the family. Every sentence made the situation worse. He was not denying the $2 million hole. I was explaining why he believed he had the right to create it. "You moved donor money without a board vote," I said. "People gave that money for housing and emergency aid. It was never yours to lend." Marcus's jaw tightened. "I am the pastor. I built that church. I know what serves the ministry better than a committee of nervous accountants." Preston gave a quiet laugh from behind his bourbon glass. "This is exactly why people like your father need professionals around them, Nia. You are treating a sophisticated bridge investment like a corner store cash drawer." I turned toward him. "Your family company has default notices attached to 3 properties in Massachusetts." For the first time, his smile changed. It did not disappear, but it became thinner. Vivian moved closer to my shoulder, still breathing hard from the slap she had just given me. "Enough! Richard and Beatrice will be here on Christmas Eve. They are not going to arrive and find this family screaming about church accounts like people who do not know how to handle money." There it was again. Not the congregation. Not the missing $2 million. Not the possibility that Preston had lied about everything. Her fear was that 2 white people from Boston might see the truth before she could polish it. Chloe finally lifted her face from the pillow. "Mom already told Preston we would fix it. Please stop making this worse." I stared at my sister. "He stole from Dad's church and you think I am making it worse?" "He did not steal," she snapped, suddenly finding her voice. Dad authorized it. Preston is going to pay it back after his fund closes. Why do you always have to turn everything into an investigation? Because nobody else in that room wanted facts. They wanted a document that could make the facts disappear. My eyes dropped to the packet again. This time I looked beyond the title page. Marcus's signature was already on the acknowledgement section. Preston's signature sat beneath his on the schedule identifying the $2 million obligation and the assets pledged against it. They had signed first because they believed the document was merely the internal paperwork required for my company to guarantee the shortage. They had never bothered to read the cross-referenced recovery language. They had been so certain I would obey that they had completed their own side of the trap before I arrived. That mattered. The signature they wanted from me was not the signature that created their debt. Their signatures had already admitted the debt and pledged the recovery rights. Mine was the final corporate acceptance that would activate the assignment mechanism. I looked at the silver pen and felt the sting in my cheek pulse once. Vivian mistook my silence for surrender. Do not embarrass us again, Nia. Sign it. Preston leaned closer, lowering his voice so only I could hear him. You built a nice little fund. Be smart enough not to lose it over pride. I almost smiled. He still thought the company I built was a frightened daughter he could corner in a family living room. He had no idea that every serious transaction I touched was structured around one rule: never sign anything until you understand who carries the risk when it fails. I understood exactly who carried the risk, and for the first time that night, it was not me. I also noticed one detail they had missed in their rush. The signature blocks for Marcus and Preston were not buried in fine print. They were plainly visible on the final schedule. Both men had signed beside the description of the $2 million obligation before I even walked into the room. Their confidence was so complete that they never imagined the woman holding the last pen might actually read what they had already admitted. Vivian pointed sharply at the glass table. That packet is the guarantee. You will sign the corporate acceptance page. Your firm will cover the $2 million shortage, and this discussion will end before Richard and Beatrice arrive. This is not a request. I pulled the papers toward me and read the final pages slowly enough to confirm what I had already seen. Marcus and Preston had signed the debt acknowledgement and collateral schedule. The language identified the missing $2 million, listed Preston's company as the primary obligor, and assigned specified shares and liquid assets as recovery collateral if the obligation was called. They thought those clauses were harmless formalities attached to the bailout they expected me to fund. Chloe watched me with wet eyes. Please, Nia, just sign it. Do not ruin my life. Preston stepped forward and rested one hand on the back of the chair beside me. His bourbon glass clicked softly against the table. Your family is giving you a chance to be useful, he said. Take it. I rubbed my burning cheek once, then picked up the silver pen. I did not ask for another explanation. I did not warn them to read their own signatures. I simply turned to the corporate acceptance page and signed my name in a single steady line. Preston exhaled a triumphant laugh. Know your place. I capped the pen and set it beside the packet. He believed my signature guaranteed his rescue. In reality, it completed the assignment structure his own signature had already accepted. The agreement did not make my company responsible for swallowing his loss. It gave my company the contractual right to call the acknowledged debt, pursue the pledged assets, and enforce the recovery provisions if the $2 million was not restored. The wording had been sitting in front of him the entire time. He had ignored it because he assumed the only signature that mattered belonged to the woman he expected to bully. The room saw a defeated daughter signing a bailout. I saw a creditor being created. The financial death clause was active. Chloe wiped her crocodile tears and stood up, smoothing the pristine fabric of her designer dress. She walked around the glass coffee table with a light, bouncy step and wrapped her arms around my shoulders in a stiff, highly orchestrated embrace. Her expensive floral perfume was nauseating, thick and cloying in the tense air of the living room. Thank you, Nia, Chloe whispered directly into my ear, her voice dripping with profound, unwavering entitlement. You finally did something useful for the family. I did not hug her back. I simply let my arms hang at my sides, absorbing the absolute emptiness of her gratitude. She pulled away, beaming at Preston, as if they had just won the lottery, completely oblivious to the reality of what had just transpired. She genuinely believed my life's work existed solely to subsidize her luxury. Vivian did not waste another second. Now that she had what she wanted, my presence in her perfectly curated space was a liability she needed to eliminate immediately. She reached into the pocket of her tailored trousers, pulled out the keys to my Aston Martin, which she had previously demanded the valet bring around, and tossed them carelessly onto the table. The heavy metal fob clattered harshly against the glass. "Now get out," my mother ordered, her tone returning to that brisk, commanding cadence she typically used to direct the church staff. "And do not come back this weekend. I absolutely do not want Richard and Beatrice seeing your face. Drive to the hotel, stay out of sight, and try your hardest not to ruin Christmas for the people who actually matter." I picked up my keys, my fingers curling tightly around the cold metal. I looked at the four of them one last time, taking a mental photograph of this exact moment. My father hiding his cowardice behind his pastoral dignity. My mother entirely consumed by her desperate, pathetic social climbing. Chloe, the beautiful parasite who had never fought a single battle in her life. And Preston, the white aristocratic fraud who was actively draining them dry while demanding their respect. They looked like a flawless portrait of elite Atlanta society, a magazine cover built entirely on a foundation of lies and stolen money. I turned and walked toward the grand foyer. I did not say a word. I grabbed my overnight bag, swiped my access card, and stepped into the private elevator. The heavy chrome doors slid shut instantly, cutting off the view of the penthouse and silencing the low murmur of their celebratory conversation. I reached out and pressed the button for the ground floor lobby. As the elevator began its rapid, silent descent, watching the digital numbers count down from the 50th floor, a profound, visceral shift occurred deep inside my chest. 34 years of relentless submission completely evaporated. 34 years of shrinking myself to make my family comfortable vanished into the chilled air of the elevator shaft. Every desperate attempt to earn my mother's love, every sacrifice I made to uphold my father's reputation, every time I swallowed my pride to maintain the illusion of black excellence for their benefit, dissolved entirely. The heavy, suffocating chain of respectability politics broke right then and there. I was no longer the obedient, tragic daughter, trying to buy her way into a family that fundamentally despised her. The grief was gone. In its place was a sharp, predatory clarity. I had just locked the cage from the outside. I pulled my phone from my pocket and called my private attorney. He answered immediately. "Activate the debt recovery clause," I said. There was a short pause. They signed the acknowledgement. Marcus and Preston signed the debt schedule before I arrived. They forced me to execute the corporate acceptance page. I heard a keyboard begin moving on the other end of the line. "Then the assignment is complete," my attorney said. "The agreement recognizes the $2 million shortfall transfers, the recovery rights to your holding company, and pledges the listed shares and liquid assets against that obligation. Your firm is not absorbing their deficit. Your firm is now the creditor entitled to call it. Call it." Understood. The elevator kept descending while he reviewed the next steps. Preston's company was insolvent. The church money had been moved without full board approval. The signed schedule gave my company a documented basis to seek emergency freezes against the assets specifically pledged in the agreement, while the underlying transfers were investigated. The people upstairs thought they had forced me to bury a hole in the books. Instead, they had put the hole in writing and handed my lawyers a collection path. Nothing about that call created a debt that did not exist. The money was already missing. Their own signatures identified the shortfall and the collateral. My signature simply activated the corporate mechanism they had misread. "What about the penthouse?" my attorney asked. That question made me look at my reflection in the elevator doors. "No paper warning tonight," I said. On the afternoon of the 24th, change the entire biometric access system. Remove every PIN, every face profile, every private elevator credential, and every garage authorization connected to them. I want the property secured before they return from the airport. You want the lockout timed for Christmas Eve. I want the ownership reality timed for Christmas Eve. The doors opened into the lobby. I stepped out without looking back at the numbers above the elevator. The legal mechanism was already moving. The debt they had tried to push onto me was now positioned against them, and the home they treated like inherited property was about to become the second truth they were forced to face. The distinction mattered because I was not inventing a new debt or taking property by magic. The $2 million already existed as a documented shortage. Marcus and Preston had just signed the schedule admitting who received it and what assets stood behind repayment. My company's role was to accept the recovery assignment they believed was a bailout vehicle. Their arrogance supplied the signatures. Their urgency supplied the leverage. All I had done was understand the paper better than the men who expected me to finance them. For years, every family emergency had followed the same pattern. Someone made a reckless decision. Vivian called it a crisis. Marcus called it duty, Chloe cried, and I was expected to convert my competence into cash. The person who created the problem kept the status. I absorbed the cost. That elevator ride ended the pattern. I was not rescuing Preston from the debt. I was not rescuing Marcus from the church board. I was not rescuing Vivian from embarrassment, or Chloe from the consequences of marrying a man she barely understood. The contract gave me a legal path to recover what had been moved, and the penthouse gave me a boundary they could physically feel. For once, the capable daughter was not going to be the emergency fund. She was going to be the collector. The elevator doors reflected a woman who had finally stopped confusing access with love. If they wanted me gone, I would go. But I would not leave my assets, my authority, or my judgment behind for them to keep using. I stepped out into the grand, echoing expanse of the ground floor lobby. The polished marble floors gleamed brilliantly under the massive crystal chandeliers. I nodded at the night concierge, maintaining the perfect, unbothered posture of a woman who owned everything she surveyed. No paper notices, I instructed, walking past the front desk toward the sliding glass doors. Change the entire biometric lock system on the afternoon of the 24th. Wipe every single fingerprint, every retina scan, and every keycard assigned to that unit from the master server. Disable their access to the private elevator. Shut down the automated garage gates so their vehicles cannot enter the VIP parking sector. I want them completely locked out of the system by 4 o'clock on Christmas Eve. I pushed through the heavy lobby doors, the crisp, freezing Atlanta night air hitting my face like a baptism. I walked toward my car feeling lighter than I had in a decade. Let them go to the airport and pick up his aristocratic parents, I said, a genuine radiant smile finally breaking across my face as I unlocked my car. Let them load the SUV with their designer luggage and their incredibly expensive Christmas gifts. Let them hype up this grand, luxurious dinner. But when they arrive back at the building on Christmas Eve, lock them out cold. It is time to show them who the real owner is. I slid into the driver's seat of the Aston Martin, the engine roaring to life with a low, predatory growl, as I pulled out of the parking garage and merged onto the quiet midnight streets of Atlanta. The sheer absurdity of the situation finally settled over me. My parents had just physically assaulted me, financially, extorted me, and banished me from the family gathering, all while standing in the middle of a fortress that I had built for them. You see the suffocating arrogance of my family, their desperate clinging to respectability politics, and their blind worship of Preston's fake aristocratic bloodline were all rooted in a massive, pathetic delusion. They paraded around that 50-story Buckhead high-rise acting like undisputed royalty. They looked down on me as if I were a lowly peasant permitted to enter their sacred space purely out of maternal charity. But the reality of that luxurious penthouse was a secret I had kept buried for nearly half a decade. 4 years ago, my father's pristine pastoral image nearly shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Pastor Marcus was hit with a devastating civil lawsuit regarding the gross mismanagement of a multi-million-dollar church expansion project. The legal fees bled his personal accounts dry faster than he could preach a Sunday sermon. The bank did not care about his standing among the black elite of Atlanta. They did not care about the designer suits he wore or the social galas my mother attended. The numbers did not lie and his accounts were empty. The bank initiated a ruthless foreclosure. The eviction notices were printed, the property was seized, and the great Pastor Marcus was literally days away from being publicly thrown out onto Peachtree Street with his luggage on the curb. I was absolutely frantic, but his toxic pride and deeply ingrained misogyny would never allow him to ask his independent business-minded daughter for help. He tried to negotiate with the bank executives, begging for extensions, restructuring plans, or any grace period they could offer. They flatly denied him. So I stepped in completely undetected. I did not do it out of some warm, overwhelming sense of familial love. I did it because, despite their constant cruelty, I refused to let my last name be dragged through the local tabloids and gossip blogs as a cautionary tale of financial ruin. I deployed one of my holding companies, a highly discreet limited liability company registered in Delaware, to swoop in and purchase the property directly from the bank in an expedited all-cash settlement. My parents never found out the truth. The banking executives, bound by ironclad non-disclosure agreements that my corporate lawyers had aggressively drafted, simply informed my father that a private anonymous investor had cleared the debt. They were told a restructuring provision allowed them to remain in the penthouse as tenants under a specialized indefinite lease agreement. In my parents' incredibly delusional minds, God had miraculously intervened. They convinced themselves that their relentless prayers, combined with their inherent social superiority, had manifested a financial miracle. They genuinely believed they had successfully negotiated a brilliant arrangement that kept their generational wealth intact. The truth was entirely different. They did not own the walls they slept within. They did not own the imported Italian tile my mother strutted across when she demanded I leave. They did not even own the custom leather sofa where Vivian had just slapped me. When my shell company bought the property out of foreclosure, we purchased it fully furnished. Every single piece of luxury decor, every crystal chandelier, down to the Egyptian cotton sheets on the guest bed where Preston and Chloe currently laid their entitled heads, belonged legally, entirely, and exclusively to me. I was their landlord, their silent benefactor, and their invisible savior. And they repaid my silent generosity by charging me $15,000 to be banned from my own dining room. The ownership file had always been clean. My holding company had purchased the unit directly from the bank after the foreclosure, paid the delinquent balance taxes and closing costs, then issued Marcus and Vivian a private occupancy agreement that allowed them to remain without public embarrassment. Their names never returned to the deed. They had possession, not ownership. That difference had protected them for 4 years. Whenever Vivian hosted a charity dinner, she told guests, the foreclosure scare had been a temporary banking dispute that Marcus had solved through influence and prayer. Whenever my father gave tours of the penthouse, he described it as part of the Washington family's generational real estate portfolio. I never corrected them. I paid the association fees through the LLC. I approved major repairs. I renewed the insurance. They signed the occupancy paperwork without reading the ownership schedules because the anonymous company name meant nothing to them. The furnishings were equally simple. When the bank sold the unit, the purchase included the contents listed in the foreclosure inventory: the leather sectional, the dining set, the guest room furniture, the art purchased with the property package. All of it sat on my company's asset ledger. Vivian had spent years boasting about rooms filled with things she had never legally owned. I had allowed the illusion because exposing it would have humiliated my father at the exact moment his lawsuit threatened to destroy his standing. That had been my final act of protection before I understood that protection without boundaries only trained them to expect more. Now the same documents that once shielded them made the security change uncomplicated. I was not seizing a stranger's home. I was securing an asset my company already owned after the people occupying it had violated the arrangement and tried to use my business as collateral for their next deception. For years they called my silence weakness. In reality, my silence had been the only reason their version of wealth survived. The paper trail inside my company made the truth almost embarrassingly simple. Property tax notices came to my LLC. Insurance renewals came to my LLC. Major building assessments required my company's approval. Every year my parents signed routine occupancy renewals without asking who ultimately controlled the entity on the other side. They never asked because the arrangement was comfortable. Comfort made them careless. That was the irony I could not ignore. Vivian spent years lecturing me about pedigree while living under a roof protected by the daughter whose independence embarrassed her. Marcus preached stewardship while never checking the ownership structure that kept him housed. They treated my business skills like an unpleasant personality trait until those same skills became the invisible foundation beneath their lifestyle. Even the private elevator access existed because my company paid the premium building fees. The convenience they treated as inherited privilege was a monthly line item on an account they had never bothered to understand. That detail made the coming lockout feel less like revenge and more like the first accurate statement the property had made in years. I drove through the empty streets, the adrenaline sharpening my focus to a razor edge. I had spent 4 years letting them play house in my multi-million-dollar asset. I had paid the property taxes, covered the astronomical homeowners association fees, and funded the very stage upon which they performed their elite societal masquerade. But the lease was officially terminated the exact second Vivian's hand struck my face to protect a white con artist. I parked the car in the secure garage of my downtown corporate suite. The preparation for Christmas Eve afternoon required absolute ruthless precision. I took the private elevator up to my office, the city spreading out below me in a sea of glittering lights. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water, walked over to my desk, and opened my laptop to monitor the progress of my security team. I needed to ensure that the digital perimeter was completely secure before the physical trap snapped shut. My phone screen suddenly illuminated the dark surface of the desk. A high-priority encrypted notification popped up from the lead technician of my cybersecurity contractor. The message was brief, highly clinical, and beautifully devastating. The new smart lock system is fully integrated. All replacement profiles are staged, and the previous biometric data is queued for deletion. Awaiting activation command. I stared at the glowing text on my screen for a long, quiet moment. The trap was fully wired, armed, and ready to snap shut. I did not type the activation command just yet. A flawless execution requires impeccable timing, and I wanted them to feel the maximum velocity of their impending humiliation. I closed the laptop, letting the dark office swallow the light, and went home to get a full night of incredibly peaceful sleep. The afternoon of December 24th arrived with a crisp, biting chill sweeping through the streets of Atlanta. While the rest of the city was wrapped in festive holiday warmth, bustling with last-minute shoppers and families gathering around fireplaces, I was sitting inside a sterile, high-tech security control center. My private security contractor had established a temporary surveillance hub directly inside my corporate boardroom. A massive wall of high-definition monitors illuminated the darkened room, feeding live, unblinking footage directly from the Buckhead high-rise. As the legal owner of the Penthouse and a premium corporate client, my security team had legally integrated our monitoring software with the building's master network. I had eyes on the lobby, the private garage, the dedicated elevator banks, and the corridor leading straight to my front door. I sat back in an ergonomic leather chair, nursing a freshly poured glass of vintage champagne, watching the monitors with the detached clinical focus of a predator waiting for its prey to step onto the mark. At exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the screen displaying the underground VIP parking garage flared to life. The heavy polished oak doors of my penthouse elevator slid open and out poured the very picture of manufactured black excellence. My father, Pastor Marcus, was dressed in a tailored wool overcoat, walking with that rigid pastoral authority he used to intimidate his congregation. My mother Vivian was draped in designer fur, clutching a limited edition Birkin bag, like it was a shield against the working class. They were followed closely by Chloe and Preston, who were practically vibrating with smug anticipation. They loaded themselves into 2 pristine luxury SUVs. One of them was the brand new Porsche Cayenne Preston had just purchased for Chloe using stolen church charity funds. The sheer audacity of driving a stolen vehicle to the airport to pick up his bankrupt, fraudulent parents was a masterpiece of aristocratic delusion. I watched through the high-definition feed as the garage gates swung open and the 2 vehicles rolled out onto the Atlanta streets, heading straight toward Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport to retrieve Richard and Beatrice. The moment the rear bumper of the Porsche cleared the garage threshold and merged into the holiday traffic, I set my champagne flute down on the mahogany conference table. The glass made a sharp, definitive click. I turned to my lead security technician, the lead technician from my security team, who was sitting at the master terminal. "They are off the premises," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of mercy. "Execute the purge. Lock it down." The technician did not hesitate. His fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard in a blur of keystrokes. I watched the central monitor as a cascade of code scrolled down the screen, rewriting the fundamental access architecture of the 50-story building. In a matter of seconds, the digital purge swept through the building's infrastructure like a silent, invisible shockwave. First, the primary biometric scanners were wiped clean. Vivian's perfectly manicured thumbprints, Marcus's retinal scan. Chloe and Preston's facial recognition profiles were entirely scrubbed from the lobby database. The system deleted their identities with zero hesitation, turning them from VIP residents into complete undocumented strangers. Next, the radio frequency identification tags were invalidated. The sleek black keycards they carried in their designer wallets, the ones that granted them exclusive access to the private penthouse elevator bank, were remotely deactivated. The digital authorization codes were scrambled and overwritten, turning their premium access keys into useless, inert pieces of plastic. Finally, the garage transponders were revoked. The automated sensors that previously recognized their luxury vehicles and seamlessly opened the titanium security gates were shut off. Their license plates were flagged and removed from the approved resident registry. The entire penthouse unit, along with every single access point leading to it, was digitally sealed, fortified, and locked down under my exclusive singular control. "It is done, ma'am," the technician reported, stepping back from the terminal. "The security grid is locked. No one enters the private elevator or the penthouse level without your direct biometric authorization. They are completely locked out." Before giving the final command, I pulled up the occupancy file and the building authorization list one last time. I wanted no sloppy shortcuts, no accidental denial of access to staff, and no technical mistake they could later twist into a story about sabotage. The penthouse itself remained untouched. Their personal belongings remained documented for supervised retrieval. What changed was permission. The system displayed 4 resident profiles under the unit: Vivian, Marcus, Chloe, and Preston. Each profile carried layers of convenience they had mistaken for entitlement. Lobby facial recognition, private elevator priority, garage transponders, guest preclearance, delivery authorization. They had lived inside my infrastructure so long that they no longer saw it as infrastructure. They saw it as birthright. I authorized the purge profile by profile. Vivian disappeared first, then Marcus, then Chloe. Preston's profile was last. I watched his name vanish from the screen and felt no rush of anger, only the satisfaction of closing an account that should have been closed years earlier. The technician confirmed that the front desk had received the legal access directive and that any personal property retrieval would require scheduled supervision. That detail mattered. I wanted them humiliated by the truth, not protected by some technical mistake they could use to reverse the story. Then the building cameras showed the airport-bound SUVs moving farther from the property. There was nothing left to do except wait for them to come home to a place that had never been theirs. I asked for one final systems check. Front entrance denied. Private elevator denied. Garage credentials revoked. Penthouse door owner authorization only. The technician read each status back to me while I watched the green indicators turn red beside 4 familiar names. Nothing was left to chance. Christmas Eve would not depend on an argument at the door. The building itself would answer for me. I nodded, feeling a profound, intoxicating wave of vindication wash over me. The invisible cage had been locked, but this time I was the one holding the only key. The hours ticked by. The winter sun dipped below the Atlanta skyline, casting long, deep shadows across the city. The streetlights flickered on, and the building's exterior holiday decorations bathed the entrance in a warm, festive glow. I remained in the control room, watching the monitors with unwavering patience. I reviewed the legal documents one last time, ensuring the corporate debt transfer and the property ownership deeds were perfectly organized in my leather briefcase. Everything was immaculate. The trap was inescapable. At exactly 7 o'clock in the evening, the perimeter cameras caught movement. The dual monitors displaying the grand front entrance of the high-rise lit up. The two luxury SUVs pulled off the main street and glided smoothly into the glamorous circular drop-off zone of the building. The vehicles came to a halt right in front of the massive glass doors. The valet attendants dressed in sharp winter uniforms immediately stepped forward to open the doors. I leaned closer to the screens watching the performance unfold in high definition. Out stepped Vivian and Marcus, their faces plastered with wide artificial smiles, radiating an overwhelming aura of elite hospitality. They were playing their roles perfectly, acting as the gracious, wealthy hosts, welcoming their prestigious northern in-laws. Next came Chloe and Preston stepping out of the stolen Porsche, looking like a picture-perfect advertisement for generational wealth. And then emerging from the back of the second SUV were the guests of honor. Richard and Beatrice stepped out onto the pristine pavement. Preston's parents looked exactly as I expected. They carried themselves with that rigid, uptight Boston Brahmin arrogance, looking down their noses at the Atlanta architecture, but desperately trying to maintain their faux aristocratic air. They were entirely bankrupt, completely insolvent, and living on borrowed time. Yet they wore their condescension like a royal cape. The six of them gathered on the sidewalk under the glittering entrance awning. The valet staff began unloading their luggage. The bellhops piled heavy, expensive-looking suitcases onto brass luggage carts alongside dozens of beautifully wrapped Christmas gifts and designer shopping bags. They were laughing, chatting amicably, completely wrapped up in their shared delusion of elite grandeur. They looked so incredibly confident. They looked like they owned the city. They turned as a united front and began walking toward the heavy glass doors of the grand lobby, ready to step into an unforgettable high society Christmas Eve, completely and blissfully unaware that they were marching straight into a titanium-reinforced brick wall. The automatic glass doors slid open, welcoming the six of them into the towering climate-controlled warmth of the grand lobby. From my monitors, I watched my mother immediately take the lead. Vivian gestured broadly at the soaring marble columns and the massive 20-foot Christmas tree decorated in silver and gold, playing the role of the ultimate buckhead matriarch to absolute perfection. Beatrice, wrapped tightly in a suffocatingly thick wool coat, offered a tight, polite nod. She masked her quiet judgment behind a thin veneer of upper-class manners, but I could see her assessing the space, calculating its worth. Richard stood beside her with his hands clasped behind his back, looking around with a forced expression of mild approval. They were all participating in the same ridiculous dance of fake wealth, recognizing fake wealth, entirely convinced of their own untouchable superiority. Preston strode ahead of the group, leading his parents toward the restricted VIP elevator bank with the swagger of a reigning monarch showing off his castle. Chloe clung to his arm, practically vibrating with pride as they approached the sleek, brushed steel doors reserved exclusively for the penthouse suites. The bellhops followed obediently, a few paces behind, pushing brass carts heavily laden with their designer luggage and perfectly wrapped Christmas gifts. The stage was beautifully set for their grand triumphant arrival. Preston reached into his tailored coat and pulled out his black radio frequency identification card. He flashed a practiced, arrogant smile at his parents, no doubt preparing to brag about the private, direct-to-foyer elevator ride they were about to experience. He tapped the card against the glowing digital reader mounted on the wall. A harsh electronic buzz pierced the quiet lobby. A solid red ring of light illuminated around the scanner. "Access denied" flashed across the tiny digital screen. Preston's smirk faltered. He let out a short, dismissive breath, muttering something about magnetic interference to his father, and tapped the card again. Buzz. Red light. Access denied. The smile completely vanished from his face. A flush of embarrassment crept up his neck as his parents watched him fail a basic entry procedure. He aggressively rubbed the card against his cashmere sleeve and slammed it against the reader a third time. The harsh rejection buzzer echoed loudly, drawing the attention of several residents waiting near the main concierge desk. Vivian's perfect hostess mask immediately cracked. She stepped forward quickly, pulling her own access card from her Birkin bag with trembling fingers. "Let me try, darling," Vivian said, her voice strained. The system is probably just resetting for the holiday. She tapped her card against the sensor. Red light. Access denied. Marcus pushed past her, his pastoral dignity slipping, as he pulled out his wallet. He slapped his card against the reader. Red light. Chloe nervously tried hers. Red light. 4 premium unrestricted access keys were completely dead. The secure elevator doors remained sealed shut, completely indifferent to their rising panic. The realization that they were locked out in front of their supposedly wealthy guests shattered Preston's carefully curated composure. His fake aristocratic restraint evaporated in an instant. He turned on his heel and stormed across the marble floor toward the main security desk, leaving his bewildered parents standing awkwardly by the brass luggage carts. I watched the audio feed spike on my monitor as he slammed his fist down hard on the polished stone counter. "What the hell is wrong with your system?" Preston shouted, his voice echoing aggressively off the high ceilings and completely destroying the peaceful holiday atmosphere. "I am a penthouse resident. We have guests waiting. You need to manually override the VIP elevator right now, or I will have your job by tomorrow morning. Do you know who my father-in-law is?" Back near the elevators, Beatrice and Richard exchanged a sharp, horrified look. True old money never screamed at service workers in public. True old money never made a scene in the lobby of a residential building. They were utterly mortified by their son's aggressive, classless outburst. The mask of superiority they had worn into the building was rapidly dissolving into deep, humiliating discomfort. Vivian rushed over to the front desk, her heels clicking frantically against the marble. She was trying desperately to manage the rapidly deteriorating situation and preserve whatever dignity they had left. She grabbed Preston's arm, pulling him back from the terrified concierge, and forced a strained, high-pitched laugh for the benefit of her in-laws. "It is just a glitch," Vivian said loudly, ensuring her voice carried across the lobby to where Beatrice and Richard stood. "The building must be running a holiday security update. Please, Richard, Beatrice. I am so incredibly sorry for the inconvenience. We will have this sorted in just a moment. Please bear with us." But they were not going to sort anything. The heavy mahogany doors behind the main reception desk suddenly swung open. Out stepped the chief of building security, a tall, no-nonsense former police captain. He was flanked by 2 broad-shouldered security officers, dressed in crisp, tactical suits. In his right hand, he carried a thick legal dossier bound with a heavy clip. The front page bore a bright, unmistakable red legal seal that stood out sharply against the white paper. The building security chief walked straight past the front desk, personnel, his expression hard and entirely unbothered by Preston's screaming. He marched directly toward the center of the lobby, stopping mere inches away from where Preston and my father were standing. He planted his feet, looked directly into Marcus's eyes, and then slowly shifted his piercing gaze to Preston. The security chief did not speak immediately. He let the red-sealed file remain visible in his hand while Preston continued demanding a manual override. That silence gave Richard and Beatrice time to notice what their son was trying not to notice. The staff were not confused. The concierge was no longer apologizing. The elevator attendant had stepped away from the control panel. The valet supervisor quietly directed both SUVs toward the secured lower parking deck after the luggage was unloaded, following standard procedure, while the access dispute was reviewed. By the time Preston realized the vehicles were no longer waiting at the curb, his voice had climbed another octave. "My parents have been traveling all day," he snapped. "Open the elevator." The security chief glanced at the card in Preston's hand. "That credential is inactive." "I know it is inactive. I am telling you to reactivate it." "I do not have authorization to do that." Marcus stepped forward, trying to replace Preston's tantrum with pastoral authority. "There has obviously been an administrative mistake. Our family has occupied that residence for years. You know who I am." "I do," the chief said. The answer landed harder than disrespect would have. Richard turned toward Marcus. "Occupied." Vivian moved instantly, forcing a bright laugh that sounded brittle even through the camera microphone. "He means owned, of course. The building staff use odd terminology. We have a private arrangement with management." Beatrice looked from Vivian to the dead elevator reader and then to the legal file. "If you own the unit, Why does a security employee need a legal dossier to explain why your keys do not work? No one answered her. Chloe began whispering to Preston, asking him to stop yelling. He shrugged her hand away. The same man who had spent years lecturing me about class was now sweating beneath the lobby chandelier because his parents were watching service staff refuse him. From the control room, I zoomed the camera in on Vivian. She kept touching the clasp of her handbag, the nervous habit she used whenever a lie required more confidence than she possessed. Her eyes moved toward the lobby doors, then the elevators, then Richard and Beatrice. She was trying to decide whether she could move the entire Christmas performance to a hotel before the truth became public. Too late. Several residents had already slowed near the Christmas tree. A couple standing beside the concierge desk pretended to study a package while listening to every word. The humiliation Vivian feared was forming around her. Marcus lowered his voice. "Chief, whatever document you are holding, we can discuss it privately." The chief did not move. Preston stepped closer, his face red. "My family did not fly from Boston to stand in a lobby while you play bureaucratic games." Richard's head snapped toward his son. "Your family." Preston realized the mistake and went silent. The security chief finally lifted the dossier. The red seal caught the lobby lights. "This is not a technical problem," he said, "and it is not something I am permitted to override." Vivian's smile vanished. I raised my champagne glass slightly toward the monitor. Now they were ready to hear who owned the house. The building's security chief did not lower his voice to spare their fragile egos. He did not invite them into a private office to discuss the matter discreetly, nor did he offer the deferential respect my parents were so deeply accustomed to receiving. He stood squarely in the center of the holiday-decorated lobby, holding the thick legal dossier as if it were a loaded weapon. The ambient noise of the grand entrance hall seemed to dissolve, leaving only the sharp, authoritative cadence of the security chief echoing across the imported marble floors. "I apologize for the inconvenience, Pastor Marcus." The security chief boomed his voice, carrying effortlessly to the reception desk. The valet stand and the cluster of wealthy residents gathered near the fireplace. "However, my directives come straight from the absolute top. The legal owner of the Penthouse unit, CEO Nia, has just issued an immediate and non-negotiable security lockdown. She has mandated a strict ban on anyone attempting to enter the premises who is not explicitly named on the property deed or the active residential lease agreement. Furthermore, my instructions indicate that the lease agreement in question was formally terminated this afternoon. Therefore, you have no authorized access to the private elevator, the parking garage, or the residence itself. As of this exact moment, you have all been legally evicted." From my vantage point, in the high-definition control room, I watched the color rapidly drain from my mother's face. Vivian's meticulously applied makeup could not hide the sudden sickly pallor of her skin. She looked as though the floor had vanished beneath her designer heels. Beside her, my father stood entirely paralyzed. Pastor Marcus, a man who built his entire career on the power of his voice, was rendered completely speechless. His jaw worked silently, trying and failing to form a coherent defense against the brutal, undeniable truth broadcast in front of his elite peers. The true devastation, however, was playing out on the faces of Preston's parents. Beatrice took a sharp, highly visible step back from my mother. Her manicured hand flew to her throat, her posture stiffening with an icy, aristocratic outrage. Richard, who had previously been inspecting the lobby with mild approval, now looked at my father with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. Renting Richard's voice sliced through the tension loud enough for the entire lobby to hear. He turned his piercing gaze directly onto my father. "Marcus, you sat in our dining room in Boston and looked me dead in the eye. You explicitly told me this penthouse was a generational family asset. You swore this property was the crown jewel of your family's real estate portfolio. You claimed you owned the entire top floor." Beatrice let out a sharp, mocking scoff. "They are tenants, Richard," she said, her tone dripping with venomous condescension. "We flew across the country to spend Christmas with a family of fraudulent tenants who are currently being evicted from a building they do not even own. This is an absolute disgrace." My mother practically lunged forward, her hands waving frantically in the air as she tried to salvage the unsalvageable. "Beatrice, Richard, please, you must understand. This is a massive, horrific misunderstanding. Vivian stammered, her voice pitching into a hysterical squeak. My daughter Nia, she is experiencing a severe mental health crisis. She is unwell. She is highly confused and acting out of spite. My husband and I own that penthouse. We are the rightful owners. This security guard is just mistaken. The building security chief did not flinch. He slowly opened the heavy legal dossier, flipping to the first page, which bore the bright red, unmistakable seal of a Fulton County judge. There is no mistake, ma'am, the security chief stated coldly, presenting the documents for Richard and Beatrice to see. I hold the verified deed of trust, the LLC ownership registration, and a court-approved emergency injunction. CEO Nia is the sole exclusive owner of the penthouse unit, and she purchased it out of bank foreclosure 4 years ago. Pastor Marcus has been living there as a subsidized tenant on her charity. That charity has now officially expired. I am legally obligated to ask you to vacate the lobby immediately, or I will have you escorted off the property for trespassing. The revelation that my father was a subsidized tenant living on my charity was the final lethal strike. The illusion of their vast black excellence, the fake generational wealth they used to bait Preston into the family, was reduced to ashes right there on the lobby floor. Residents who had stopped to watch the commotion were now openly whispering. A few people had even pulled out their smartphones, their camera lenses pointed directly at the disgraced pastor and his humiliated family. Preston could not handle it. The public exposure of his in-laws' poverty mirrored his own deeply hidden financial ruin, and the sheer humiliation of his parents witnessing this pathetic display broke whatever fragile restraint he had left. His face contorted into a mask of ugly, violent rage. The fake polished gentleman from Boston completely vanished, replaced by a desperate cornered fraud. "You shut your mouth!" Preston screamed, his voice cracking with pure panic. "I live here, you work for us. I will have you fired and sued for slander by tomorrow morning." He lunged forward, his fists clenched, attempting to grab the building's security chief by the collar of his uniform. It was the worst mistake he could possibly make. He never even made it within arm's reach. The two massive, broad-shouldered tactical guards flanking the chief moved with terrifying speed. In a blur of highly trained motion, they stepped into Preston's path, neutralizing his attack instantly. One guard caught Preston's extended arm, twisting it sharply downward, while the other planted a heavy hand squarely in the center of his chest, shoving him backward with enough force to send him stumbling over his own expensive leather shoes. Preston crashed hard into one of the brass luggage carts, sending beautifully wrapped Christmas gifts tumbling onto the marble floor. Chloe shrieked a high, piercing sound of pure terror and rushed to kneel beside her husband. She was sobbing uncontrollably now, the perfect holiday vacation she had bragged about mere hours ago, transforming into a catastrophic public nightmare. Her brand-new Porsche was locked in a vault she could not access. Her penthouse bedroom was sealed. Her wealthy in-laws were staring at her with unabashed revulsion. "Do not touch him again," Marcus bellowed, finally finding his voice as he stepped toward the guards. "We are leaving. We will handle this legal mess in court. Then I suggest you gather your belongings and exit through the front doors." Pastor, the building security chief, replied entirely unfazed. "Your vehicles have been secured in the lower decks. You may contact the legal department on Monday to arrange for a supervised retrieval of your personal items. Until then, you are all officially banned from the premises. Have a safe and Merry Christmas." Sitting in the dimly lit control room miles away, I watched the glorious, chaotic fallout unfold across my wall of monitors. I watched Richard and Beatrice refuse to help Preston off the floor. I watched them signal the valet to call them a private black car, completely separating themselves from my disgraced parents. I watched Vivian cover her face with her designer handbag, desperately trying to hide her tears of profound, agonizing humiliation from the smartphone cameras of her wealthy neighbors. They were forced to drag their expensive luggage back out into the freezing Atlanta night, shivering on the sidewalk without a home, without their cars, and without a shred of their precious dignity. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, the cool glass of the champagne flute resting comfortably in my hand. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The vintage champagne tasted crisp, sharp, and exceptionally sweet, the flavor of absolute victory. Right at that exact moment, the silence of the control room was broken by a sharp, vibrating buzz. My personal cell phone resting, face up on the mahogany desk, illuminated the dark room. The screen flashed frantically with an incoming call. I glanced down at the caller ID. It was Vivian. My mother was calling, undoubtedly standing on the freezing pavement outside the building, shivering in her designer fur, finally realizing that the daughter she had treated like garbage held the keys to her entire existence. I picked up the phone. I looked at her name flashing across the screen. I thought about the slap she had delivered yesterday. I thought about the 10 years of my youth I sacrificed for them. I thought about the $15,000 invoice they forced me to pay. I smiled a genuine radiant expression of pure liberation, and I pressed the red button to decline the call. My thumb had barely left the screen before the phone vibrated again. Then again, and again. I placed the device face up on the expansive mahogany desk and leaned back in my chair watching the notification counter skyrocket. In the span of 10 minutes, I registered 33 missed calls. They were rapidly alternating between my mother, my father, and my sister, a frantic, disorganized rotation of absolute desperation. When the calls went unanswered, the text messages began pouring in. The progression of their messages was a spectacular masterclass in narcissistic collapse. First came the furious, blind entitlement. Chloe's name flashed across the glass screen. "Open these doors right now, you crazy witch. You are embarrassing us in front of Preston's parents. Unlock the elevator immediately." When that yielded nothing, the tone shifted to aggressive pastoral authority. My father, Marcus, attempted to command me, as if I were still a frightened teenager, sitting in his church pews. "I am calling the Atlanta Police Department," he texted. "You will be arrested for illegal lockout and grand theft of our vehicles. I demand you open these garage gates right this second. Do not test me, Nia." I actually chuckled out loud in the quiet control room. He wanted to call the police to report that the legal owner of a property had secured her own home. I silently dared him to dial 911 and explain why a revoked residential access credential entitled him to force open a private garage before management arranged the vehicle's supervised release. But as the minutes dragged on, and the freezing Atlanta wind outside the building began to penetrate their designer coats, the hostile demands completely shattered. The reality of their permanent eviction finally set in, and Vivian's texts shifted into a desperate, pathetic stream of begging. "Nia, please. I am begging you as your mother. Richard and Beatrice are standing right here on the freezing pavement. People are staring at us. Please do not humiliate the family like this. We can talk about the money. We can fix the church accounts. Just let us inside. Please do not do this to us on Christmas Eve." I ignored every single notification. I turned my attention back to the massive surveillance monitors on the wall. The high-definition cameras captured the physical reality of their situation on the curb outside the towering glass lobby. The temperature in Buckhead had dropped sharply into the low 30s. My mother was shivering violently, clutching her expensive fur coat tightly around her shoulders. Her perfect salon blowout completely ruined by the biting winter wind. She looked frantic, her eyes darting around the pristine drop-off zone, as if hoping a miracle would manifest a warm living room for her to hide inside. But the real show was happening between Preston and his parents. Beatrice and Richard wanted absolutely nothing to do with this catastrophic public embarrassment. They were fake aristocrats, but their aversion to public scandal was entirely real. The cameras showed a sleek black taxi pulling up to the curb. Richard barked an aggressive order to the driver, while Beatrice hastily threw her Louis Vuitton weekender bag into the open trunk. Preston rushed forward, his face pale with panic. He frantically grabbed the car door, physically trying to block his father from getting inside his mouth, moving rapidly as he pleaded with them to stay. He was likely spinning some desperate lie about a legal misunderstanding, begging them to wait while he sorted it out. But Richard simply shoved his son's hand away. The older man's face was twisted in absolute unfiltered disgust. He climbed into the back seat, slammed the heavy door right in Preston's face, and signaled the driver. The taxi sped off into the dark night, heading for a luxury hotel downtown. They abandoned him on the sidewalk with his fraudulent broke humiliated in-laws without a second thought. The exact second, the taxi disappeared around the corner. The fragile, toxic alliance between my family and Preston completely imploded. From the silent video feed, I watched the body language rapidly escalate into pure hostility. Preston turned on my father, waving his arms wildly, his face red with rage. The white savior of the family was now aggressively blaming Marcus for the eviction, the loss of the cars, and his own public humiliation. Marcus did not back down. My father pointed a rigid, furious finger right back at Preston's chest, stepping into his space. The polished pastor who preached grace and dignity was shouting in the middle of the street. Chloe was crying hysterically, stomping her designer boots on the pavement, pulling at Preston's arm, but he violently shrugged her off. Vivian stood frozen on the periphery, her hands covering her mouth, watching her entire social universe burn to ashes on the corner of Peachtree Street. They were completely stranded. Their bank accounts were leveraged or frozen. Their stolen Porsche was locked securely inside my biometric vault. They had nowhere to go, no leverage to use against me, and absolutely no audience left to impress. I reached out, shut down the security monitors, closed my laptop, and went home to my own quiet, peaceful space. I got the absolute best sleep of my entire adult life. The missed call counter stopped at 33 only because I finally placed the phone on Do Not Disturb. I took a screenshot before I did it. The number felt like a summary of our family dynamic. They had ignored me for years until access to my money, property, and silence disappeared. Then everyone remembered how to call. Outside building staff allowed them to collect luggage that had never entered the residence while the vehicles remained in the secured garage, pending formal retrieval through management. The Porsche was still tied to Preston's financial mess. I did not need to own it. I only needed to stop treating his convenience as my obligation. I woke up on Christmas morning feeling incredibly rested and profoundly light. There was no chaotic family cooking, no passive-aggressive remarks about my single status to dodge, and absolutely no $15,000 catering bills to subsidize. I took a long, hot shower and walked into my expansive closet. I bypassed the festive holiday colors and the casual loungewear. I went straight for armor. I selected a tailored emerald green power suit, a crisp white silk blouse, and my sharpest black stilettos. I pulled my hair back into a sleek, flawless bun and applied my makeup with meticulous, ruthless precision. Today was not about holiday celebration or family reconciliation. Today was about finalizing a financial and emotional execution. I had received a detailed update from my private security team early that morning. After spending hours shivering on the curb and screaming at each other, my family had eventually caught a cheap rideshare to a budget motel out by the interstate. It was the only place they could afford with their remaining pocket change, as my lawyers had already initiated the freeze on Preston's accounts and the church's compromised funds. But by 8 o'clock on Christmas morning, they had returned to the scene of the crime. They were currently sitting inside the upscale corner cafe, directly across the street from my high-rise, staring hopelessly through the windows at the glass doors of the building they used to claim as their own kingdom. I grabbed my heavy leather briefcase. Inside it contained every single signed document, every damning bank statement, the property deeds, and a high-quality audio player containing the recording of their extortion from the day prior. I drove downtown and met the two attorneys handling my corporate and litigation work in the lobby of my office building. We climbed into my Aston Martin and drove the short distance toward Buckhead. The morning sun was bright, blinding, and ice cold. We pulled up to the curb right in front of the coffee shop window. Through the glass, I could see the four of them hunched around a small circular table. They looked utterly destroyed. Their expensive clothes were wrinkled and stained from sleeping in a cheap roadside motel. Vivian's face was haggard, completely stripped of her usual arrogant, moisturized glow. She looked like a woman who had aged 10 years overnight. Marcus looked completely defeated, resting his elbows on the table and rubbing his temples in deep, silent despair. Chloe and Preston sat as far away from each other as physically possible, staring into empty coffee cups, the fairy tale romance completely dead. I killed the engine of the sports car. I picked up my briefcase, opened my door, and stepped out onto the crisp pavement. I was flanked by two of the sharpest, most expensive corporate lawyers in the entire state of Georgia. I adjusted the lapels of my emerald suit, lifted my chin, and pushed open the glass door to the cafe. The bell above the cafe door chimed a cheerful, festive greeting that completely contradicted the absolute devastation sitting at the corner table. I walked in my emerald green power suit, commanding the space with both attorneys flanking me like two sharply dressed executioners. My presence immediately sucked the remaining oxygen out of the small room. My mother, Vivian, spotted me first. The exhaustion and humiliation that had been weighing down her features instantly vanished, replaced by a feral, unhinged rage. She shot up from her metal chair, knocking her lukewarm coffee across the table. She lunged at me, her hand raised fully, intending to deliver a repeat of the brutal slap she had given me in the penthouse yesterday. But I was not standing in her living room anymore, and I was not unguarded. Before she could even cross the 3 feet of space between us, the security professional who had quietly followed our legal team inside stepped smoothly into her path. He did not hurt her. He simply raised a massive, immovable forearm, blocking her strike with the effortless ease of a concrete wall. Vivian slammed into his arm and stumbled backward, gasping in shock, as if she were the one who had just been assaulted. "Do not touch her," the security professional stated, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that instantly silenced the murmurs of the other morning patrons. "You will remain seated, ma'am." My father Marcus leaped to his feet. His pastoral composure was completely obliterated. His face was a dark mottled purple, and the veins in his neck bulged against his wrinkled collar. "You are a devil!" Marcus roared, pointing a trembling finger right at my face. "You are an absolute monster. You destroyed this family. You ruined my face in front of my in-laws. Do you have any idea what you did to us last night? We were treated like common criminals on the street." I placed my heavy leather briefcase onto the small coffee-stained table. I popped the brass latches. The sharp metallic clicks sounded like gunshots in the tense quiet of the cafe. I reached inside and pulled out the thick, meticulously bound legal document. The exact same document they had forced me to sign less than 24 hours ago. I tossed it onto the table. It landed right in front of my father with a heavy thud. "You are right, Dad," I said, my voice smooth, chilled, and completely devoid of empathy. "I did ruin your face. I destroyed the fake, pathetic illusion you value more than your own flesh and blood. But you brought this entirely on yourself. You were so blinded by your desperation to cover up a massive financial scandal that you forgot the most basic rule of business. You forgot to read the paper you forced me to sign." Chloe, who had been openly weeping into her hands, looked up. Her eyes were bloodshot and terrified. Preston leaned forward, his arrogant posture finally showing genuine cracks of panic. "What is she talking about?" Preston snapped, looking at my father. "It was a standard corporate guarantee. I saw her sign it." My father rose first, rage returning the moment he saw me enter the cafe. He pointed at me across the small table and called me a devil, a monster, the daughter who had humiliated him in front of his in-laws. Vivian came up behind him with her hand already lifting for another slap. She never reached me. The security professional accompanying my legal team stepped between us and raised one arm, stopping her without touching her beyond what was necessary to block the strike. Vivian staggered back, more shocked by the boundary than by the resistance. "Remain seated," he said. I set my leather briefcase on the table and opened it. Marcus kept shouting. "You threw your own parents into the street on Christmas Eve. You destroyed my name in front of Richard and Beatrice." "You are right about one thing," I said. "Your image is destroyed, but you destroyed it when you decided a fake reputation was worth more than the truth." I removed the same packet they had forced me to sign and dropped it in front of him. Preston leaned forward. His face was exhausted but still hostile. "That is the guarantee. She signed it." One of my attorneys opened the packet to the signature schedules. "Read the names before you read the title." Marcus looked down. His signature was there. Preston's was beneath it. My attorney continued. "The document identifies the $2 million shortfall, acknowledges Preston's company as the recipient of the disputed funds and pledges specified shares and current liquid assets as recovery collateral." The corporate acceptance signed by Nia did not make her firm responsible for covering your loss. It completed the assignment of recovery rights to her holding company. Preston snatched the packet and began scanning the pages. You tricked us. No, I said. You refused to read. My second attorney placed a separate copy of the schedule beside him. The agreement was presented by your side. Pastor Marcus and Preston executed the acknowledgement before Nia signed the acceptance page. Once that page was executed, the creditor rights described in the schedule became enforceable according to the contract. Marcus sank back into his chair. Preston shook his head violently. The underlying transfer was legal. Marcus loaned me the money. There is no theft. Vivian seized the argument immediately. Exactly. Family helps family. You cannot turn a loan into a crime because you are angry. I reached inside my blazer and placed a digital recorder on the table. Their faces changed at the same time. Georgia permits a participant in a conversation to record it, I said. Yesterday I was a participant. I pressed play. The first sound was my father's fist striking the chair in the penthouse. Then Marcus's voice filled the cafe. Preston moved that money out of the church fund because I authorized it. I gave him permission to use it as an investment. Stop calling it theft. My recorded voice followed. The housing charity fund, the $2 million missing from the account. Then Marcus again angrier. Yes, that fund. I am the pastor. I decided where the money would do the most good. The room around us went still. The recording continued with Vivian's voice sharp and impatient. Are you going to use this trash evidence to destroy this family's face in front of our white in-laws? Sign the guarantee and close the $2 million deficit before anyone outside this family sees it. I stopped the recording. Preston's argument collapsed in his expression before he said another word. The issue was no longer whether money had moved. Marcus had admitted that Preston took money from the church charity fund, admitted that he authorized the transfer without treating it as an ordinary public process, and Vivian had admitted that the purpose of my signature was to close the resulting deficit before outsiders discovered it. I slid the recorder toward my attorneys. That is why I am not debating this anymore. Preston tried one final time. You cannot prove I intended to steal anything. The investigation will determine intent, I said. What I can prove is where the money went, what account received it, what shell company held it, and what you bought while the church fund was missing $2 million. Chloe stared at him. The Porsche. He did not answer. I opened the audit folder and turned the first page toward the table. The transfer chain was printed in clean columns. Grace Fellowship Charity Account. Intermediary Bank. Massachusetts Shell Company. Payments tied to Preston's obligations. My father looked at the page and finally stopped yelling. The man who had spent his entire life using a pulpit to control the room had nothing left to say when the numbers spoke first. I closed the folder. You wanted me to sign something so the problem would disappear, I said. Instead, you signed an acknowledgement that gave my company a recovery path, and then you gave me a recording explaining why the problem existed. Vivian's hands began to tremble. Preston pushed his chair back hard enough for the legs to scrape across the cafe floor. This is coercion. This is blackmail. No, my attorney said. This is documentation. I stood straighter. Christmas morning was no longer about getting back inside the penthouse. That argument was finished. They were now looking at the contract, the audio, and the audit trail. And for the first time they understood that the locks had only been the beginning. I picked up the recorder and slipped it safely back into my blazer pocket. I leaned over the table, placing my palms flat against the cold surface, bringing myself eye to eye with the people who had treated me like garbage for over a decade. I straightened my posture, pulling back from the table, and turned to my attorneys. I reached into my blazer pocket and handed him the digital recorder, then gestured to the thick dossier of financial audits sitting on the table. One of them took them with a sharp professional nod, sliding the evidence securely into his own briefcase, alongside the signed asset forfeiture documents. I looked back at the four shattered faces staring up at me, letting the absolute finality of the moment settle over the room. I am sending the complete, unedited financial audit, along with this audio recording, directly to the Grace Fellowship Executive Board by noon today. I stated, my voice carrying no trace of hesitation. Simultaneously, my litigation attorney is filing a formal report with the Atlanta Police Department for a white-collar crime investigation outlining the entire $2 million embezzlement scheme. We are handing over the routing numbers, the shell company details, and the authorization records. The church board will have to cooperate with the investigation, and the authorities can seek freezes on whatever assets remain. I shifted my gaze exclusively to the fake Boston aristocrat. Preston was trembling so violently that the metal legs of his chair rattled against the cafe floor. His perfectly styled hair was disheveled, and a cold sweat had broken out across his forehead. He was no longer the smug, untouchable son-in-law, looking down his nose at me. He was a cornered animal, realizing the trap had just snapped shut on his neck. "Preston," I said, making sure he heard every single syllable. "You played a very arrogant game, but you played it against the wrong woman. Prepare yourself to answer for embezzlement. If the police confirm what these records show, prison is no longer an abstract threat. And since your parents just abandoned you on the sidewalk last night to save their own skin, I highly doubt they will be paying for your criminal defense attorney." The possibility of prison time hit Preston like a physical blow. The last remaining shred of his false superiority vanished into thin air. Chloe, completely unraveled by the sheer speed of her fairy tale collapsing, let out a choked, desperate sob. She lunged forward, throwing her arms around Preston's neck, burying her face into his expensive cashmere sweater. She was crying so hard she could barely breathe, her perfect makeup running down her face in dark streaks. "Preston, please, we can fix this," Chloe wept, her voice high-pitched and hysterical. "Tell them it is a mistake. My dad will protect you. We can just give the money back. We can explain it to the church." But Preston was no longer playing the devoted, wealthy husband. With a sudden, vicious surge of panic and blind rage, he aggressively shoved Chloe away. The force of his shove sent her stumbling backward, her hip crashing hard against the edge of the metal table. She let out a sharp cry of pain, but he did not even look back to see if she was hurt. "Get off me!" Preston screamed, his face twisted in pure, unadulterated malice. He looked at his weeping wife not with love, but with absolute venomous disgust. "This is all because of your crazy, vindictive sister. I am ruined. I have lost absolutely everything because your pathetic, desperate family could not keep her in check." He did not wait for a response. Preston spun around violently, shoved a passing waiter out of his path, and bolted for the cafe door. He burst through the glass exit, sprinting down the icy Atlanta pavement as fast as he could. He abandoned his wife, his father-in-law, and his entire fabricated life without a single backward glance, leaving Chloe wailing uncontrollably on the cafe floor as she watched her husband disappear down the street. Chloe looked from the contract to the recorder, as if one of them might suddenly change shape and rescue her. "Dad said it was temporary," she whispered. "Preston said the Boston deal would replace it." Marcus closed his eyes. That was the closest he came to admitting what he had done. I did not need another confession. I needed the evidence preserved and delivered exactly where the outline of their consequences already led the church board and the police. My attorneys secured the recorder and the audit file in separate sleeves. I watched Vivian follow every movement with panic. The papers leaving the table frightened her more than any insult I could have thrown at her, because once they left my hands, she could no longer turn the crisis into a private family argument. "This is what you never understood," I told her. "You kept calling everything family business because you thought family business did not have rules. Money donated to a church still has rules. Corporate assets still have rules. Property still has rules. And I am done breaking rules for people who break me." Chloe started crying harder. She reached toward her father instead of me, but Marcus did not move. His eyes stayed fixed on the table. The hierarchy that had governed our family for years had collapsed in less than 24 hours. Preston had no money. Marcus had no authority. Vivian had no social shield. Chloe had no one left to perform helplessness for. Then Preston stood, his chair scraped backward. He looked at all of them with open disgust, as if the family he had exploited had somehow failed him by being caught. I watched Chloe stare at the door Preston had just run through. The marriage she defended at my expense had lasted only as long as he believed her family could protect his money. That realization hurt her, but it was not mine to soften. My father sat perfectly frozen in his chair. Pastor Marcus, the man who had traded his own daughter for social leverage, stared blankly at the wall. His eyes were vacant. He looked like a man who was already standing in front of a judge, realizing his 30-year career, his church and his freedom were completely eradicated. But my mother Vivian was not done. The reality that her precious social standing, her church royalty status, and her golden child's marriage were completely destroyed, finally shattered her ironclad pride. The arrogant matriarch of Buckhead completely broke down. Vivian threw herself off her chair. She fell heavily onto the hard, coffee-stained floor of the cafe. She crawled forward on her knees, completely ignoring the shocked stares of the other patrons, the horrified gasps of the barista, and the physical presence of my security team. She reached out and wrapped her arms tightly around my legs, burying her face against my knees. She was literally begging at my feet. "Nia, please," Vivian wailed, her voice cracking with raw, unfiltered desperation. "I am begging you as your mother. I brought you into this world. Please do not send those files to the church board. Do not destroy your father's career. He will lose everything. The congregation will cast us out. We will be ruined in Atlanta. And please do not do this to your sister. Do not make Chloe lose her husband. She loves him. I will do anything, Nia. I will get on my hands and knees and apologize to you every single day. Just please withdraw the evidence." I looked down at the woman sobbing at my feet. For 34 years, I had craved her validation. I had sacrificed my education, my finances, and my peace of mind just to earn a fraction of the devotion she freely gave to Chloe. I had endured her insults, her backhanded compliments, and her relentless attempts to make me feel small. A decade ago, I would have broken down and forgiven her just to have her hold me. But the woman she was begging did not exist anymore. That desperate, eager to please daughter died the moment Vivian threw my car keys on the table and told me to get out of my own house. I slowly bent down. I did not speak with anger. I did not raise my voice. I reached out, my hands firm and incredibly steady, and grabbed her wrists. I coldly, deliberately pried her trembling fingers off my legs. I stepped back, severing the physical connection between us forever, and looked down into her tear-streaked, terrified eyes. "You chose the Porsche," I said, my voice cutting through her sobs with absolute chilling finality. "You chose the fake reputation, the aristocratic in-laws, and the illusion of superiority over your own daughter. You made your choice when you slapped me and told me to bail out a thief." I looked at the three of them one last time, taking in the complete wreckage of their lives. "Now," I said, turning my back on them and walking toward the door, "enjoy the Christmas gift I got you." Exactly 2 weeks later, the consequences had moved far beyond our private family war. Grace Fellowship's executive board acted first. They reviewed the audit trail, listened to the recording, and removed Marcus from his pastoral position. The same leaders who had once deferred to him now wanted a formal accounting of every transfer connected to the missing charity money. The board referred the file to the Atlanta Police Department for investigation, exactly as my legal team had warned would happen. My father could no longer hide behind a sermon. He had to answer questions with documents. The scandal spread quickly through Atlanta's elite circles. People who had praised the Washington family as a model of discipline and respectability began speaking about the $2 million shortfall, the Christmas Eve lockout, and the Boston Shell Company in the same breath. Marcus discovered that reputation is not armor when the underlying records contradict the story. The same people who once waited for his approval now avoided being photographed beside him. Preston's family reacted with equal speed. Richard and Beatrice issued a public statement from Boston, distancing themselves from their son's financial activity and denying any involvement in the church transfers. They cut off their support for Preston and made it clear that they wanted no connection to the legal exposure surrounding him. Whatever fragile alliance had existed between their household and Chloe's was over. The old money connection Vivian had worshipped disappeared the moment it became expensive. Preston was left facing the investigation without the family name he had used as a shield. The Boston company that had made him look impressive now looked exactly like what my audit showed. It was a shell wrapped around debt. Every conversation he had once dominated became a question about where the church money went. Chloe's life collapsed around the same time. The Porsche she had bragged about on the phone was repossessed once the financing and source of funds were challenged. Without Preston's fake wealth supporting her, she had to leave the luxury space she had treated as permanent and move into a small apartment outside the part of Atlanta she used to consider acceptable. For the first time in her adult life, appearance could not pay a bill. The change was brutal because Chloe had never learned how to build anything that did not depend on someone else's account. She had spent years calling my independence lonely while treating dependence as proof of status. Now the car was gone, the luxury address was gone, and the marriage she had displayed like a trophy was breaking under the weight of Preston's blame and the investigation around him. Vivian suffered the punishment she feared most: social exposure. She had spent decades engineering a flawless image, deciding who was present at dinner, who was allowed to speak, and which daughter looked better beside the family's public reputation. Now she avoided the people she had once chased for approval. Invitations stopped. Conversations went quiet when the family scandal came up. She no longer wanted to walk into the same rooms where she had once displayed Chloe and Preston as proof that she had arrived. I did not have to exile her from those rooms. Shame did that for me. There was no single dramatic moment when the family broke apart. It happened through ordinary consequences. A church office Marcus could no longer enter. A Porsche Chloe no longer had keys to. A Boston surname that no longer protected Preston. A mother who suddenly understood what it felt like to be excluded from the rooms she had built her whole identity around. None of it required me to call and gloat. I did not need to. The truth was doing the work. The investigation also destroyed the family's ability to control the narrative. Vivian tried to frame the situation as a private misunderstanding, but the records were already with people outside the family. The board had dates, amounts, signatures, and the recording. There was nothing left for her to smooth over with a dinner invitation or a carefully worded explanation. Chloe learned the same lesson in a different way. Without the Porsche, the penthouse, or Preston's borrowed prestige, she could no longer walk into a room and let luxury answer questions for her. Every practical problem she had once pushed toward me now stayed in her own hands. Rent, transportation, bills, the ordinary responsibilities she had spent years calling beneath her. Vivian hated that more than poverty itself. She had built her identity around being seen as the woman whose family had escaped every form of struggle. Now the people she wanted to impress knew that the image had been financed by denial church money and my silent protection. For once, nobody could redirect the cost toward me. I was not paying the legal bills, replacing the car, repairing the reputation, or inventing another rescue plan. The collapse stayed exactly where it belonged, with the people who had built it. The irony reached deeper than money. Marcus had spent years preaching that public character mattered more than private discomfort. Now his private decisions were the reason his public character could no longer survive. Vivian had treated social acceptance like a currency, and suddenly no amount of polished clothing could purchase silence. Chloe had been trained to see a wealthy husband as security, only to discover that borrowed status disappears faster than earned skill. I watched all of it from a distance. That distance was part of the consequence. They could not call me to negotiate a softer landing. They could not ask me to explain the records differently or quietly replace what was missing. The woman who had spent years turning their emergencies into solutions was no longer available. They had to live inside the numbers exactly as they were. I heard fragments of the fallout through formal channels because the investigation required documents from my company, but I never used those updates as an excuse to re-enter the family drama. Each request was answered with records, not emotion. Each question received dates, amounts, and signatures. That was all. For years, Vivian had insisted that the family survive by controlling what outsiders were allowed to know. The scandal destroyed that strategy. Once the church board and police had the same documents I had seen, nobody in my family could edit the story by shouting louder. The facts existed independently of their approval. That was the real collapse of the Washington image. It was not that everyone suddenly hated them. It was that the image stopped controlling the evidence. 2 weeks into the new year, the cold January air whipping across the city. I drove back to the Buckhead high-rise for one final visit. The building staff, now fully aware of who actually owned the property, greeted me with profound deference as I walked through the lobby. The building security chief personally escorted me to the private elevator, swiping his master override card to grant me access to the penthouse level. The heavy oak doors slid open. I stepped into the sprawling residence. The massive space felt entirely different now. It was completely stripped of their toxic, suffocating energy. I had ordered a premium moving and liquidation company to clear out the entire unit. As I walked through the grand foyer, I watched a team of professional movers carefully wrapping the custom Italian leather sofa and the expensive dining room chairs in protective plastic. I was selling every single piece of furniture, every crystal chandelier, every remnant of the false luxury they had enjoyed on my dime. The proceeds were being redirected into a specialized grant fund. My company had just established a fund designed exclusively to support young independent Black women entrepreneurs who needed capital to start their own businesses without relying on anyone else. I walked past the workers and stopped at the entrance of the formal dining room. The space was mostly empty now, the large mahogany table already disassembled. I stood perfectly still, looking at the exact spot where this entire chain of events had ignited. I looked at the marble kitchen island where Vivian had snatched the wineglass from my hand. I looked at the doorway where Preston had leaned smirking as he tossed that $15,000 invoice at me. I remembered the heavy, arrogant certainty in their eyes, the absolute conviction that they could abuse me, erase me, and extort me without ever facing a single consequence. The silence of the penthouse was profound. There were no more insults echoing off the high ceilings. There were no more artificial laughs, no more frantic plotting to maintain a fake image. The air was clear, and perfectly still. I stood in the exact place where I had been humiliated, but I did not feel a single ounce of sadness. I felt the pure, unadulterated power of a woman who had meticulously orchestrated her own justice. The private elevator chimed behind me, breaking my momentary reflection in the empty dining room. The heavy oak doors slid open, and the luxury real estate broker handling the sale stepped into the stripped-down foyer. He was impeccably dressed in a bespoke navy suit, carrying a thick, embossed leather portfolio under his arm. He stopped for a second, his eyes sweeping over the vast, echoing expanse of the cleared-out penthouse. Without the heavy, pretentious furniture and the suffocating aura of my family's fake aristocracy, the sheer architectural magnitude of the space was breathtaking. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the entire living area, bathing the bare hardwood floors in crisp, natural winter sunlight. "We did it!" the broker said, a sharp, highly satisfied grin spreading across his face as he walked toward me. "And when I say we did it, Nia, I mean we completely shattered the ceiling. The bidding war closed at 2 o'clock this morning. We secured an all-cash offer from an international tech conglomerate looking for a southern executive retreat. They did not just meet your asking price. They exceeded it by 20% to lock out the competing buyers. You have officially set the highest price per square foot record in the history of this zip code." I nodded, feeling a deep, stabilizing sense of closure. I gestured for the broker to follow me, bypassing the formal dining area and walking directly into the sprawling, sunlit kitchen. I led him straight to the massive marble island. It was the exact spot where Vivian had snatched the wineglass from my hand. It was the exact spot where Preston had arrogantly tossed that ridiculous $15,000 catering invoice. Now the marble was completely bare, wiped clean of their toxicity, waiting for a much more lucrative transaction. The broker unzipped his leather portfolio and laid the heavy premium stock closing documents flat against the cold stone. He handed me a sleek silver fountain pen. I looked down at the paperwork. I did not feel a shred of hesitation or nostalgia. I pressed the pen to the signature line and signed my name with bold, fluid, absolute certainty. With a few strokes of ink, I completely erased my family's entire fraudulent kingdom from the Atlanta real estate registry. The penthouse was sold. The chapter was permanently closed. "Congratulations," the broker said carefully, gathering the executed documents and sliding them back into his portfolio. "The wire transfer of the closing funds has already been authorized by the escrow attorney." The capital should hit your primary holding account within the next 60 seconds. He paused, looking at me with genuine professional admiration. What is your next move with a windfall of this magnitude? Are you rolling it into a new commercial development? I pulled my secure tablet from my briefcase, waking the screen with a biometric scan. I opened my encrypted banking portal, watching as the massive multi-million-dollar wire transfer officially cleared the pending status and settled into my corporate account. I am not keeping a single dime of it, I told the broker, my voice steady and resolute. I tapped the screen, selecting the newly established routing numbers for a specialized financial trust I had legally incorporated earlier that week. I authorized the immediate total transfer of the entire Penthouse sale proceeds into a designated capital grant fund. I had specifically structured this foundation to aggressively bypass traditional banking prejudices and venture capital biases. Every single dollar generated from the sale of that suffocating toxic monument to respectability politics was now being converted into pure, unrestricted seed capital for independent Black female entrepreneurs. It was a war chest designed exclusively for women who were building their businesses from the ground up. Women who were told they were too loud, too ambitious, or too unconventional. Women who had been marginalized by their own communities, pushed out of family expectations, and forced to survive on their own grit. I was taking the exact wealth my mother tried to use to impress a fake white aristocrat and weaponizing it to build an army of powerful, financially independent women who would never have to answer to anyone. The broker raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed by the sheer scale of the maneuver, shook my hand warmly, and stepped back into the private elevator. As the doors closed, taking the broker and the last remaining tie to the Buckhead high-rise with him, I packed my tablet away and walked out of the penthouse for the final time. When the transfer was complete, I did not feel the rush I expected. I felt quiet. For years, the penthouse had been proof of a contradiction. My family used it to perform a version of power while treating the person who actually protected the asset as an embarrassment. Selling it ended that contradiction. There was no longer a secret owner, no hidden rescue, no private arrangement keeping their image alive. I handed the final access packet back to the broker and looked around the empty room one last time. The marble island was just stone again. The private elevator was just machinery. The skyline was beautiful, but it no longer carried the weight of a family argument. That mattered to me more than the record sale price. I had spent too many years believing victory meant finally being recognized by Vivian Marcus or Chloe as the person who had saved them. I no longer wanted recognition from them. I wanted distance so complete that their approval could not change my day in either direction. The fund receiving the sale proceeds would keep working long after I stopped thinking about the penthouse. That was enough. I did not need a plaque, a family apology, or one final confrontation in the empty dining room. I needed the chapter closed. When I stepped into the elevator for the final time, I did not turn back before the doors met. The building descended out of view one floor at a time, and with it went the last physical space where my family had mistaken my generosity for permission to control me. In the weeks and months that followed, the sale society waited with bated breath for the inevitable reconciliation. The Southern elite, particularly within the traditional church circles my parents used to dominate, absolutely love a redemption arc. People expected me to be the bigger person. They expected the successful, wealthy daughter to eventually soften her heart, extend an olive branch, and pull her disgraced family out of the ashes of their own making. They assumed that because we shared the same blood, I was biologically obligated to absorb their abuse, accept a mediocre apology, and restore them to their former glory. They were completely wrong. There was no reconciliation after the sale. I did not reopen communication because people expected a holiday forgiveness story. I changed my personal contact information, directed any necessary legal communication through counsel, and removed myself completely from the cycle of demand apology and renewed demand. I did not arrange secret meetings, answer emotional appeals through third parties, or use my money to rebuild the image they had destroyed. Blood did not restore access. An apology would not have restored access either. The boundary was permanent because the pattern had been permanent for far too long. I was finished financing access to me with guilt. I sit here now, relaxing deeply into the plush dark velvet cushions of the sofa in my new residence. The ambient light in the room is warm, rich, and perfectly engineered, highlighting the genuine art on the walls and the absolute peace in my environment. There is no tension in my shoulders, there is no anxiety about meeting impossible expectations, and there is certainly no fear of being belittled in my own space. I look directly into the camera lens, holding your gaze with unwavering, absolute clarity. A slow, radiant, wildly unapologetic smile spreads across my face. They called me a disappointment. They kicked me out of the family Christmas dinner. But they forgot the most basic rule of power. You cannot evict the landlord from her own house. Next time, if someone tells you that you do not belong in their world, just walk away. Then quietly buy that